Hi, I'm Dr. Avanti Kumar Singh. In over 20 years of practicing both Western medicine and Eastern healing traditions, the most important thing that I've learned is that healing is a journey we take together. So on this podcast, I'll be demystifying Ayurveda and other integrated medicine, showing how these simple, ancient practices are the keys to unlocking a healthy modern life. We are all healing catalysts because healing starts within. It starts with you, and it starts right now. This is a Soulfire production. Episode number 130. Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to the Healing Catalyst podcast. Today, we're discussing a topic that I've wanted to talk about for a long time: intergenerational familial trauma. As I was doing research on epigenetics for my second book, The Longevity Formula, I found that there were a lot of studies linking epigenetics, trauma, and longevity. And it's a topic that I've become really interested in because I see the parallels between epigenetics and Ayurveda so clearly. Let me explain what I mean. Epigenetics means on top of genes, and it's the study of changes in gene expression that don't involve alterations to the underlying DNA or DNA sequence. Instead, epigenetics is all about the environmental factors that affect how genes are turned on or turned off. More importantly, some epigenetic modifications that are caused by stress and trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next, potentially influencing the health and behavior of offspring based on the experiences of their parents or their grandparents or even generations before that. And so this helps explain how intergenerational familial trauma is an epigenetic factor that can affect all aspects of our health: mental, emotional, and physical. And I see this as a direct correlation to what Ayurveda teaches us, that all of life affects our health. You know, we've already talked about this probably on every episode of this podcast in one way or the other, that our relationships, environment, career and work and passions, our diet, our lifestyle and routines, all of these things can either support our health or weaken our health. And once again, modern science proves ancient wisdom. In essence, what we've known for thousands of years in Ayurvedic wisdom is what the science of epigenetics has shown. And so when I was introduced to Kimberly Shannon Murphy by a mutual friend, Tara Stiles, because Tara had just finished reading Kimberly's book, Glimmer, and was telling me how deeply moved she was by it, I read it and was equally impressed by the honesty and strength that Kimberly wove into every page and her vulnerability in sharing her story of intergenerational familial trauma so raw and so openly. And I just knew I needed to have her on the podcast to talk about this topic and its link to epigenetics. A little bit about Kimberly. Kimberly Shannon Murphy is an award-winning stunt woman who has served as a double for numerous A-list actresses. I mean, the list is so incredibly long. It's so impressive. And she's performed in over 133 feature films and television shows, including Top Gun Maverick, Captain America, The Eternals, The Old Guard, Bird Box, The Hunger Games, The Lone Ranger, Salt, Enchanted, Marvel's Agent Carter, Euphoria, Big Little Lies, and Westworld. A Taekwondo black belt, she received the 2020 Taurus World Stunt Award for Best Fight in a Film. And she's also a two-time Screen Actors Guild Award winner for Best Stunt Ensemble. She's also the author of the poignant memoir, Glimmer, in which she shares her profound journey of healing from childhood sexual abuse and intergenerational familial trauma. In our conversation, Kimberly and I discussed the epigenetic implications of intergenerational trauma and explore how movement, storytelling, and authentic self-expression have played pivotal roles in her healing journey. If you or someone you know and love has experienced trauma, I know this episode will help you. I am so honored to share my beautiful heart-to-heart conversation with Kimberly Shannon Murphy, about the epigenetic implications of intergenerational familial trauma and how to begin the journey of healing it. Hello, Kimberly. I am so happy to meet you finally. How are you doing today?
Well, how are you?
I'm well. I'm so glad that we were connected by our mutual friend, Tara Stiles. And I remember her telling me after she read your book how impressed she was and how moved she was by it. And so I got a copy also, and it's really beautifully written. So thank you for putting your work out into the world and sharing your story. I think it's really important.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Yeah.
she's incredible. I adore her. We've actually known each other since we were in our early 20s. Like, we modeled together. So it's really funny how the world works you back to certain people.
Yeah, exactly. It's so cool. I always love how the world gets smaller and smaller, as you are starting to do this kind of work in the world. So, so I am so excited to talk to you. So many of the things that you wrote about really brought up so many thoughts for me as I was writing my second book about longevity and was writing about epigenetics and genetics. And I just had so many thoughts swirling in my mind about intergenerational trauma and epigenetics, which we'll get to. But I kind of wanted to start, I'm so fascinated by your journey and your career as a stunt woman. I have to say, I've never met anybody who is a stunt woman or a stunt person. So this is really interesting for me. So why did you become a stunt woman? That seems like such an interesting career to pick. Why did you do that?
I completely fell into it. I was dancing at Avanti and also doing professional acrobatics. And a lot of my friends were getting into stunt work. And, in retrospect, I met Dr. Bruce Perry while I was writing my book, and he endorsed my book, and he is one of the top trauma doctors as well. And he said to me, I don't think you realize, Kimberly, how much you were actually healing yourself through movement of your body. I wasn't doing it consciously then, but looking back, I think it really saved me in a lot of ways. And that's how I was able to express myself in a healthy way. And so, my friends started doing it. And then my name got to this coordinator, and I got my first job in 2004 and just never stopped working since. So it was kind of a random thing. I didn't even know that the business existed. I didn't know anything about it. So it wasn't like I was seeking it out. It just sort of happened.
Right. That's so interesting. And so the idea of movement as being healing, because we talk about that a lot on this podcast and how movement is so healing. And again, our common friend Tara would say the same thing, right? That movement's very healing. And so, what's interesting in what you said is that, stunt work is so much more than just movement, though. It's like pushing your body to the limits, and doing all kinds of acrobatic, things, but I imagine very scary. I'm just imagining what it's like to jump off of a building, a set, and, all that kind of stuff without any harnesses or anything like that. So it almost feels like that's like pushing your body to an extreme in ways. And so do you feel like that really helped also, as you look back on what, was said to you about movement being healing? Do you think that sort of pushing your body to an extreme also was healing, or was it a double-edged sword? What are your thoughts about that?
I don't think in the beginning it was, because of where I was in my head and where I wasn't in my healing when I first started doing stunts. So I do believe that there is a correlation between high impact sports and trauma. I think there's a lot of people that involve themselves in high impact sports, whether that's MMA, UFC, stunt work, when you're on a high level, pushing your body. I do think that many of us have a lot of childhood traumas. And I do think that that was part of it for me. There was this risk factor in it. There was, in the beginning of my career, not now, but there was sort of sense of, I don't really care if I get hurt or what happens to me. There was this subliminal sort of subconscious thing that was going on in the beginning of my career, for sure.
And you think that that was more with stunt work, but not with the dancing and the acrobats like that? You don't feel like there was that connection then? It started when you started doing stunt work, really?
Yes, because stunt work is different in the sense of you are putting yourself at risk, especially doing the
Right.
bigger gags of, something goes wrong, you could die. So, I mean, it
Right.
is a life or death situation in a lot of the bigger stunts I've done. So it's different in dance and in acrobatics. You don't really have that. Of course, there's
Sure.
always a risk of anything happening when you're
Sure.
doing with your body, but it's not like the level of being a stunt woman.
Yeah. And I imagine there's something like related there, just from my medical background, of the adrenaline rush, the cortisol surge that you have doing that kind of a high impact, high risk activity that can also sort of like medicate or numb a trauma. Like, have you ever experienced that?
Yes, completely. I think that, when you're going into a big stunt, you have an adrenaline rush and it does numb you and it does
Mhm.
feel good in the sense of, you're the center of attention. Everything is about you. You have to do this thing and execute it in a certain way. And there is a
Mhm.
lot of feelings around that. And I think for a long time that kept me going. And I don't know if it was in the most positive ways when it came to my mental health, but
Mhm.
that's what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I imagine. And it's like, it's probably a little bit of also sort of having almost control over your body because you know what's going to happen when you engage in that high risk activity in doing a stunt, right? You know you're going to get the adrenaline rush and you sort of can predict what's going to happen as far as how you feel versus
Yes.
what's actually going to happen, right? And so I imagine that predictability is actually something that is in this sort of strange way very comforting to someone who's gone through trauma.
Yes. It's familiar.
Yes, familiar. That's the better way to say it. Yeah. And, because what I'm thinking of as you're saying this also is that, there are so many things that so many of us use to numb ourselves to the
Mm.
feelings that we're trying to avoid. And we do it subconsciously. It may not be as extreme as, doing stunts, but, whether it's scrolling or eating or shopping or gambling or, using any kind of illicit drugs, any of that can also be to numb subconsciously in
Yes.
in different ways. Yeah. So it's sort of the same mechanism as I think what I'm hearing you say
Yes. I
from
think
your
so.
experience. Yeah. Okay. Well, so I also want to move to sort of this idea of epigenetics, like I mentioned. So I was writing about epigenetics in my second book. And, the idea of epigenetics is that our cells carry memories of trauma from previous generations. And
Yeah.
though that expression of epigenetics over the genes can actually alter genetic expression. So it's like it washes over our genes. And, I think that what I was thinking about is how does intergenerational familial trauma relate to epigenetics? And so, like, based on your experience and your healing journey, how do you think the trauma that you have inherited, that you've written about, maybe has altered your epigenetics and your gene expression?
I think it completely altered it. I feel like I didn't, because it started so young, I
Mhm.
didn't really know who I was. I didn't have a sense of self. I didn't know who I was before this had happened to me because it started when I was 2. And then I do believe that I've been doing a lot of psychedelic therapy. And for me, that's been extremely healing. It's not for everybody. And, it needs to be done in the right setting. I have a doctor that I do it with, and it's not like I'm going in the woods and sort of like doing it by myself. I have a doctor that I work with, and we do therapy beforehand, and then we journey, and then we do therapy after. But I will say, in one of my journeys, I literally had all my ancestors like there, like in my living room. They were all just there. And there was this overwhelming sense of, I kept hearing in my head, like, you did the thing, you did the thing. And the thing was the book, right? So it felt
Mhm.
like I have all of these ancestors sort of on my back that have suffered trauma, and nothing was done to stop it until I came along. And I do
Mhm.
believe that that is a very powerful thing. And I do believe that it lives in our cells and our nervous system. And unless we really excavate it and speak it and work through it, it doesn't change, right? So you're either walking around repeating cycles or you're walking around breaking cycles, especially when you've had the level of trauma that I have.
Mm-hmm. And so do you feel like really writing the book was the turning point for you? Or do you sort of, I mean, I imagine you probably had some turning points before that that even got you to the point where you could share your story. Because it's a very personal, deep story and very emotional and hard. So do you feel like there was something that happened before that sort of started to shift that healing of that trauma?
I always was a truth teller. It's just, and we see this when we have children, right? We can be an impression on our children, but also there's a part of them who they just are who they are. They come out in a certain way. And I came out as being very vocal about not feeling right about how my family was functioning because it wasn't healthy. And I was always the truth teller of my family. And so writing a book was something I always wanted to do. And I always thought it was important. And then I had my daughter and things became even clearer to me. And my family system, even after my grandfather died, was functioning in extremely unhealthy ways. And I could deal with them myself. But then when I had my daughter and I could see the effect it was having on her, it changed everything for me. And I didn't want to have a relationship with these people because they weren't aligned with where I wanted to go with all of this and what I wanted to do with all of it. And just goes to show you how layered and how much pain is behind generational trauma. And it's rare that the one person, the scapegoat or whatever you may call them, sort of plucks himself out of the system and does something differently. And I do feel like that's what I was put here to do with all of this.
Yeah, I would agree, just having read your work and followed you. And that definitely this was why you're put on this earth, to help us with this.
Yeah.
And so, you said something about being a truth teller from a young age. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because I think it's quite remarkable to be able to be a truth teller at a younger age than at an older age. So how did that show up for you?
My grandfather was, as you read in the book, and there's a lot that I left out too, just because I didn't want it to be, I wrote this for survivors. I didn't want it to be triggering for people. I wanted it to be digestible. And so, now with all of the doctors that I've spoken to about, that's read my book, about my situation, my grandfather was a really sick man. And I always knew that it was wrong, what was happening. Like nothing ever felt okay or right for me. And in my own household, I write about having one sister who's sort of in the book, but she's not really, her presence is there, but I don't write about her. I actually have three sisters and, they didn't want me to speak about them. And so in respect to their wishes, I didn't. But, that goes back to like the hiding and the not wanting to speak the truth. And at the end of the day, this was my story and I wanted to tell my story alone. But even in my own household, my dad was an alcoholic and he really struggled with his own demons. He was in Vietnam when he was 18. And so he had his own trauma that he brought into the family. And obviously my mom had hers because she was abused by her dad her whole life. So there was a lot that was happening at home too for me that wasn't healthy and wasn't okay. And I was very vocal with my parents about that, especially when I turned 15 and I started having my memories and always spoke out. And so I don't really know where that came from. I feel like it, I call it now my Glimmer, my inner child who was always sort of screaming from the inside, like, this is not how life should be. This is not okay. But when you're in it and it's all you know, and your parents are your attachment and you need them to survive, it's how you have to live. There's no other choice,
Right. Yeah. And so I imagine that, reprogramming that child response, right, that you had when you were a child, and then reprogramming that as an adult has probably been like a huge part of your healing journey. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. I do believe that the reprogramming started when I started doing my psychedelics. Like that was a huge change for me. And also meeting Gabor and I say this in the book, him sort of bringing to my attention that my primary trauma was not my abuse, that my primary trauma was that I was cut off from adult support, which is how the abuse happened in the first place. And it seems like a really simple thing, but it was something that I never thought about, because I think I wanted to protect my parents so much because they were all I had. And so really having to look at the whole system is something I think that a lot of survivors struggle with, right? Because we blame the abuser, of course, because they're to blame, but you really need to look at the whole system and how that abuse was able to live in the system and how those things were able to happen to you. There were other adults around that didn't do anything about it. And, I don't believe when you have abuse of the magnitude that I had, that everybody just didn't know.
Right. And so you're saying that being cut off from the adult support is actually quite literally adults in your life looking the other way.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually really profound. As I'm thinking about it, I just wrote it down. Actually, the primary abuse was not actually the abuse that you were suffering, but it was actually that you were cut off from adult support. Like people looked away. That was the primary abuse.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Because there's no safety net, right? So in a healthy family, if I was abused, I would feel safe enough to go to my mom and say, this just happened. Like, this is not okay. This just happened. And it would have been validated and looked at and I would have been taken out of the situation and it would have been handled in a healthy way. And it wasn't, and it never was. And, and I talk about this in the book, like being at my grandfather's funeral and having one person after the other, all of his children go up there and speak about how he was the most amazing person in the world. And my one aunt said he was like Jesus Christ. And it's, now in my adult space, I'm like, wow, the level of denial that they had to have had and the narrative that they had to have built around this family system in order to survive was massive.
Yeah. I'm just taking a breath because I just want to think about what you just said, because it's actually really profound. I have a few family members who've been through something similar, and just thinking about their situations and this idea of the adults turning the other way. What's coming up for me as you're saying that is that, this also goes back to something I often talk about on this podcast, with healing, that, the basis of my work in Ayurveda is really reawakening the healer that's within. And that means tuning back into your intuition. And what you're talking about is so much about other people also tuning into their intuition, that if they're sensing that there's something wrong in the family and they turn the other way, what's the result of that, right? And it also dawns on me that perhaps, this is the pattern of intergenerational trauma, is the family pattern of turning away from an instinct, from an insight that you have. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if my mom wasn't traumatized and my father wasn't traumatized, who knows what my life would have looked like? I think it would have looked very different, because I'm doing the work now. I have a daughter. I have removed us from my entire family for that exact reason, because things started happening in the family system that were really unhealthy and not okay for me. And it wasn't in the level of sexual abuse, but it was other ways of abuse, gaslighting, narcissism, all the things that we sort of happen to us when we're raised in this system, right? My mother's parents were complete narcissists. Her father was a sociopath. I believe my grandmother was too. And so my mother grew up under that. And so how does she show up as an adult if she hasn't, returned to herself, which is what I like to say, if she hasn't found her authenticity? And that was a big thing for me too. Like the difference between attachment and authenticity, right? We have this attachment to our family and everybody has it, but are we able to be authentic in that attachment? And if we're not able to be authentic and we can't show up as ourselves to everybody, then we're not able to be ourselves. And then we can never return to self, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have to unpack that because I'm thinking about what you're saying. It's really, really important. And so I just want to go back to it. So you're saying that it was about attachment and being authentic. So can you walk us through that again? Because I think this is really important. It's not something that I necessarily would think about. And I really want to learn from you. So can you explain that more for us, Kimberly?
Yeah. So I'm doing an event in October with Gabor in Santa Monica, and it's literally called Return to Self, Navigating Attachment and Authenticity. And those are the two things that he introduced to me as well that I never looked at.
Yeah.
And our attachment is our attachment to our parents. We're born being attached to our parents. And is it a healthy attachment or an unhealthy attachment? Right.
Okay.
So in my case, it was an unhealthy attachment to both my parents. And to my siblings too, because they were raised in the same system. So, I think for years we all gaslit each other, and, everyone has some form of narcissism in my family. And what I realized when I wrote the book and when I sort of felt like I needed to ask everybody in my family for permission, like, is it okay that I'm going to tell my story? And how they all showed up back to me, which, some just stopped talking to me. Some, it was like, you're going to ruin everyone's life if you write this book. And it really made me take a step back and realize that I wasn't able to be my authentic self in this family system, because being my authentic self is coming back to my truth, right? I need to speak my truth, and I need to be validated by the people that were with me in this, that the adults that didn't do anything, all of the people that are in this system. And if I need to show up differently, which is how I felt, like if I called this sister or this aunt or this person, I had to be somebody else to everybody in order to make them comfortable. So I was never being my authentic self because it wasn't accepted.
Right.
So it's the idea of coming back to yourself and being able to figure out who your authentic self is. And sometimes that can be really hard when you've had so much trauma and it's so layered. But it became very important to me. And I realized that I couldn't be the mother I wanted to be if I was not showing up as my authentic self. Because if I'm telling my daughter to always tell the truth and to be true to yourself and to love yourself, and you should be the first love of your life and all these things, and I'm not emulating that, she's going to follow what she sees, not what I tell her.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what I'm thinking about is going back to something you talked about just earlier, a little while ago, is about this idea of truth telling, and that you from a young age were the truth teller in your family. And that to me sort of seems linked to this idea of being authentic. And so it almost seems to me, and again, I could be, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that your attempts to be a truth teller when you were younger was actually an attempt to be authentic.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And it wasn't accepted.
Right. Right. It was just shut down all the time. And so, to make people feel comfortable, to not deal with the past, and maybe again, for them to turn away from their own intuition and say it didn't, that's not what's going on, sort of thing. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing that's interesting about my family is nobody ever said this didn't happen. This was never something that anyone ever disputed. Everyone was because it happened to mostly everybody. Everyone was very aware of it. But I think what kept everyone where they were is that they weren't able to fully process it themselves. And it was too uncomfortable and it was too painful for them. And so I like to say it's just like surviving, but it's not really living. And it's really sad. And it just shows you how much pain one person can spread through a family.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's intergenerational. So it's like there's some source of it. And then it just comes down through generations because no one stops it or no one is willing to be that truth teller, right? Like you're trying to stop the intergenerational trauma, right? That's sort of what, yeah. Let me go back to the epigenetics piece, So what would you say, having like sort of understood this, idea that, our cells have memory and that there was probably something in you that was saying, oh, I have a memory of this. This is like much bigger than even me, of like what's happening to me. This is intergenerational. How do you think that, the epigenetics of this intergenerational familial trauma actually imprinted on you? Like, are there any things that you've like sort of discovered that you'd be willing to share that you have found really were the imprints on you?
You mean the effects on me?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it affected my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I wouldn't be here without it. It's a really kind of weird feeling, right? Because I can sit here and be really happy about the work that I'm putting into the world because of my trauma and the people that I'm helping. But yeah, I wouldn't, if I had two really healthy parents and healthy grandparents and everything I grew up in a different way, I definitely would be a completely different person, 100%. I mean, it lives in our body until we start unpacking it. And that takes a lot of work. And when you have had trauma, especially over the course of your whole childhood, like I did, there were so many memories. I have, it's like 10 years of unpacking all of the things. And until we can really look at them and see them for what they are, we can't sort of reprogram our brain. That's how I feel about it. And I've seen that through my psychedelic work and how I've been able to uncover these memories and then sort of have an understanding about why I do certain things that I do and why my behavior is certain ways sometimes. And like my daughter, for instance, is like this just being this incredible being. And she, loves plants and loves crystals. And she just always wanted a bunch of plants in her room. And I had such a intense reaction to her wanting to bring plants into her room. And it was like, it took me off guard the way I reacted when she asked for a plant. I was like, absolutely not. Sure. We don't bring dirt into the house. Like, that's ridiculous. And then I sort of had to check in with myself. Like, why did you have such a strong reaction to her asking for a plant? This is ridiculous. And then when I went into one of my journeys, I had a memory that surrounded like my grandfather kicking me into a cactus, like in their home. And so it all just sort of clicked for me, right? So it was this like deep embedded memory that was living in my cells and living in my nervous system that I was fully unaware of. And then once I was able to unlock it, I was like, oh, that's why you don't want plants in the house, because it's like literally it's a trigger for you. You didn't even realize it. And once I was able to unpack that with my therapist and work through that, I was like, my daughter has a full room full of plants now. And, talking about your authentic self, this is who her authentic self is, right? She wants to, this is what feels good for her. And I almost took that away from her because of my trauma without even knowing it.
Right. And so right there, you caught yourself with like not supporting your daughter in expressing her authentic self because of the trauma that you'd experienced. So interesting.
Yes.
Really, really insightful.
And I didn't even know it. And I think that happens so much with people. Like,
sure.
we're triggered for a reason. Like our triggers can be our biggest teachers if we allow them to be. If we can stop for a second and say, why am I having this reaction to something that shouldn't have this reaction? And I think so many people aren't connected enough with themselves to be able to do that. And so they just sort of go through life allowing themselves to be triggered and get angry and take it out on their kids. And then we're just perpetuating the cycle and it's just continuing, because then we're creating things in our children that they're going to now pass on to their children. And then it just goes and goes and goes.
Yeah. What I'm thinking about as you're saying that is that, I always say is that, every symptom that you have, however subtle or obvious, it can be emotional, mental, physical, it is showing up for a reason. And it's up to us to say to that symptom, why are you showing up? To ask the questions. And so I think what you're saying is the same thing, is that a trigger is also a symptom, right? It's coming from somewhere. It's causing a reaction, a symptom, an emotional outburst, a pain. It can manifest as something living in your body, a pain, a back spasm, all these different things, right? And so I think what you're pointing at in a very, very real way is that when you stop to ask yourself, why is this trigger showing up? And again, you may not have the answer. And I don't want to make it like oversimplified and say, oh yeah, the symptom's going to tell you why it's there. The trigger's going to tell you why it's there. That usually, like you said, it takes years of work. It's, through your psychedelic work that you've been able to unlock some of those things. But I do think that the first step is asking the question, right?
Completely.
Stopping and asking that question.
Yeah.
Being curious about it. Yeah. So when did that sort of start to happen for you? Like being curious about the triggers? Because, you started as a stunt woman. We were talking about that and how that was probably a really effective subconscious way to numb the feelings, to numb the triggers maybe that you were having, before you got on set. How did you move from that to, getting to the place where you started asking the questions of the triggers?
I think that the final piece of all of this for me was the need to walk away from my family, because I was trying so hard to heal around all of the people that made me sick. And it's just impossible. And, it doesn't mean that it will be forever. But I think that if you're really wanting to do the work, there can be this sort of really difficult balance when you're trying to heal and your family's on a different journey and on a different path. And so for me, I, always wanted everyone to heal and to do all the things. And for many years, I sort of got into that rhythm of trying to show everybody that this is the way. And, and at the end of the day, it's not the way for them. It's the way for me. And I think the space that I was able to create by walking away, as painful as it was the space that I needed to find myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. Because it's very easy to fall into doubting yourself, actually, when you're being told something so different by the people who were your caregivers, your primary caregivers. And be influenced by their belief systems, their thoughts about what happened or what didn't happen. And then sort of saying to yourself, well, wait, am I imagining things? Or, and so that separation was necessary is what you're saying.
Yeah, because it can pull you back. It can definitely, it can pull you back. You can do all this work and then, you're trying, for me, trying to explain to my parents or trying to get them to understand. And, they just aren't. My father just passed away, but, for so many years, it was like beating my head against a wall, trying to show him or actually just needing him to see me and see what I had been through and to try to get to the other side of it. And, you can't force people to do things they're not ready to do.
Yeah. And so how do you think that, storytelling through your memoir has sort of, helped you rewrite your story maybe and reclaim your identity and yourself and sort of, stop the intergenerational trauma being passed down another generation to your daughter? Because intergenerational trauma or any kind of abuse or trauma is often all about silencing the victim, right? And then you have the opposite to that, which, if we think about narrative medicine, which is, there's a whole field of this, of the idea of sharing our stories, storytelling as being a very healing medicine, really, that storytelling is medicine. How do you think that, writing this has been that medicine that you needed?
Because everything starts with the truth. Everything. And being able to put that on paper for me, my truth, finally, in my way, on my terms, was extremely powerful. And also because I had a ghostwriter who was incredible, I'm getting these, she's sending me chapters. We're going back and forth. We're editing together. And reading your story on paper as it's being perceived from somebody else is actually a really powerful thing. And just having the people around me now, the doctors around me that can validate my experience for what it was, and realizing that trying to force my family to validate my experience was never going to happen. And matter of fact, I didn't need it, validation from them. It was always inside me. And yes, I've been so lucky with all of the doctors I've come into contact with since I wrote my book, and they have taught me so much, and I'm so grateful for that. And yeah, I think that putting the book out into the world, seeing how many people it's been helping, strangers that have reached out to me, like hundreds of strangers, of people that feel seen and heard, and all the things that I wrote the book for, has been extremely healing for me.
Yeah. And so I want to ask you about, the psychedelic journeys. One of my very close friends, colleagues, mentors, Dr. Thanmeet Sethi, she often is on this podcast with me, and she's actually an expert in psychedelic journeys. Also, she's an MD, and this is the work she does. I would love to hear from your perspective as a patient. How is a psychedelic journeying? How has that helped you in this process of healing? Because I think it's something that many people are really interested in and really trying to see if it could help them, but it's so hard to find information of how it could help them. So I'm wondering if maybe you'd share a little bit about that.
Yeah. And I think Dr. Schwartz from Internal Family Systems puts it perfectly. When we do a journey, it basically takes away our protectors, right? So we create these parts of us that become our protectors to protect us from what is happening to us. And disassociation being one of them, right? So when I was being abused, I disassociated, like completely left my body, because I couldn't, your brain is an amazing thing. And that's what it did for me, so that I could survive what was happening to me. And so your protectors just kind of go offline when you're in a psychedelic experience and your heart is really open. And I've done so much work around that now, where I've been able to like connect with my inner child, which was a huge step for me, and getting her to trust me, which was a huge step for me, and getting us kind of like integrated together as one person instead of two people, which is how I felt for a really long time. It speeds up the process immensely. I mean, I started doing it 2 years ago, and what it's done for me in 2 years is more than, of course, talk therapy and EMDR, all those things are super important and super helpful as well. And some people are afraid of the psychedelics and they don't want to do it. And I think it's a different journey for everybody. But for me, with the level of trauma I had, I think that I need it so that I could uncover things that were really stuck there, that were in my normal world, were too difficult to get in touch with.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that you mentioned was that you've done it with a physician who is taking you through the journey. And that's really, I mean, from my perspective, it's really important as a physician and knowing someone who does it. So from your perspective as a patient, what have you found that was really important about that piece? Because again, there are lots of people putting lots of things out there on the internet saying, I'll take you on a journey, I'll take you to this place, that place. And it's a lot of people are very confused about what to do because they want the help so desperately, right?
Yes. And I think that can get really dangerous too, because you need to be working with someone who understands your level of trauma and can point you in the direction of the right medicine, the right dosage. Like all of those things are really important. And if you're not working with a doctor who can provide that for you, I would never do it any other way. I think that that's really important. And Gabor is the one who sort of put me in touch with her. And just the way they do it, they have a whole system of the integration and how it all works. And it's really important, and it changed my life. I mean, absolutely changed my life.
Yeah. And I do want to be really clear to all the listeners that, psychedelic medicine, certain psychedelics they're not legal yet. They're supposed to be in the next year. and that most of the work that's being done with physicians is through studies. So these are all, legal research studies, and people are being enrolled into studies for psychedelic journeys to look at the impact on emotional health, on trauma, et cetera. So this is by no means, saying that you should go do something illegal. These are all things that are above board. So I just want to be clear about that with the listeners.
Yes.
I just realized I should say that.
I believe ketamine is legal now. And that is one of the psychedelics I have used. But yes, the other ones are not legal yet.
Exactly.
And I think that's why it's so important to do it with a doctor who, like I said, is gauging you. Like, she took me very easy into it. Like, the first time I did it, I just did MDMA, and it was a very low dose. And, she's able to sort of, and she keeps notes about everything and my dosage and so it's something that's important to do if you're going to do it the right way. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's just really super important. And again, I also want to be clear that Kimberly did not go to Dr. Thamid Sethi. We're talking about two different people. She's talking about a different doctor. I'm talking about somebody else. So just let's be clear about that.
Totally different doctor. Totally.
Yes,
I don't know
exactly. Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, I want to ask you a question. You may have answered this already, but why is the title of your book Glimmer?
It's really interesting. And after I named it, I didn't even know that glimmer is opposite of trigger. When I named it, I had no idea. And I speak about this in one of the chapters, feeling like there was always this light inside me, this like truth telling piece of me that felt like my glimmer. And I realized that was my inner child, always trying to, speak out, heal, get authentic, all of the things. And then after I named the book, I don't know who said it to me, but there was this doctor, Dr. Deb Dana, who coined the phrase a long time ago. And I actually spoke with her about it as well after. She's older now, but we had a Zoom call about it. But yes, it is the opposite of trigger, but I named it after my little girl.
Amazing. Amazing. And so I always love to give, practical tips for anybody who might be listening, who has gone through something similar or really identifies with your story for whatever reason. What are some things that you could offer to them as, sort of a starting point of what they could do to sort of, really start to heal that part of them, for them to really, sort of heal that inner child? Because, one of the things that you talked about is that, being strong isn't about, all the physical stuff. Like, you're extremely strong. You're a stunt woman. You've been dancing and doing acrobats for all your life, right? But that really being strong is about loving yourself, about the emotional piece of that. And so what are some things that you could suggest to people who are listening about developing that kind of strength?
I think that it comes from within you. And I think a lot of times we make the mistake of trying to get it from other people. And it's just never going to come from anybody else, but from inside yourself. So we all have to start the work in there. And it means something different for all of us. All of our journeys are very different. All of our traumas are very different. But I think if you can get in touch with yourself, your inner child, and start moving towards the ways that feel authentic to you without everybody else's noise and opinions in your head, that's the best step forward.
Yeah. Well, I have so many more questions that I want to ask, but I know that we're sort of running out of time. But we'll do this again, because I think, this is a heavy topic and this is a lot to think about. The self-reflection, the truth-telling, the being authentic to yourself, How do you hope that your memoir will help other people?
I know it already has so many. And, I wrote this for my 15-year-old self. And I know that if I had a book like this when I was 15, if someone gave me a book like this, it would have changed my life. And so that's what I hope for.
I agree with you. I think it's changed a lot of people's lives already. I just have one last question for you that I always ask all my guests when they come on the podcast. If I offer up the phrase to catalyze healing, what comes up for you?
Just self. you have to come back home to yourself. And sometimes we don't know what that means. And it takes time to find it. But once you start doing it, you'll understand and see how important it is.
Yeah. Kimberly, thank you so much for being on the podcast and for sharing so openly and truthfully. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks again for listening to The Healing Catalyst. If you love what you heard, please hit follow and pass it along to a friend. And if you're feeling really inspired, please rate and review so that others can find this podcast more easily. To learn more, head to avantikumarsingh.com. And to connect with me directly, find me on Instagram at avantikumarsingh. I'll be back next week and hope that you will be too. Until then, remember, with the right catalyst, you have the power to activate your own healing, because healing starts within.